An in-depth look at the people and events that shape our community. This is Iowa in Focus.
This week, the final push to the end of the 2016 election, the tragedy in Des Moines shaking Iowa to its core. Welcome to Iowa in Focus. We're giving context to what happens in the headlines and on the campaign trail. That process all starts with the barnstorm. The biggest Iowa news of the week had nothing to do with politics. Early Wednesday morning, 2 police officers were shot and killed while they sat in their patrol cars. 39-year-old Des Moines police officer Tony Baminio and 24-year-old Urbandale officer Justin Martin were found with fatal gunshot wounds. Their accused killer is Scott Green, who has a history of run-ins with police. That very same day, vice presidential nominee Tim Kaine and Bill Clinton were scheduled to be in Des Moines. They canceled those events, but they kept earlier ones in Dubuque and Waterloo. Kaine did address the shooting, but he also pushed early voting, and Bill Clinton made one last appeal to voters in the Waterloo area. They did talk about what happened in Des Moines, along with Republican Congressman Rod Blum, who is also in the Cedar Falls, Waterloo area.
We don't know everything that we'll know over the next few days. It may speak to mental health. It may speak to the overproliferation of guns. Every tragedy has to be mourned, and families have to be supported.
It's very, very tragic, and it's just hard to believe in America something like that could happen.
There is never a justification for killing someone who's spending his or her life trying to protect you. And we pray for their families.
The biggest national news from last week just lingered over this past week. FBI Director James Comey announced last Friday the FBI was looking at more Hillary Clinton emails. That got him a lot of criticism, especially after it came out that he released that information when no one in the FBI had even reviewed any of the emails. Even Iowa's Republican senator, senior senator Chuck Grassley, thought that Comey was out of line. Chuck Grassley wrote Comey a letter saying that Senator Grassley thought you clearly face a difficult decision about whether and how much to disclose about this new information. Any choice would have been seen as affecting the election. Grassley says he agrees that Comey should have come forward, but that he should have released more info about what was actually being investigated. The letter continues, without additional context, your disclosure is not fair to Congress, the American people, or Secretary Clinton. The factual context is important. But even before then, open enrollment for the Affordable Care Act started, and the Trump ticket took aim at the Health Care Act. Just a few days ago, we learned that the plans are going to be more expensive, so Trump is doing what he can to tie Hillary Clinton to it.
Insurers are leaving, premiums are soaring, doctors are quitting, companies are fleeing, and deductibles go through the roof. Workers' hours are being cut, hiring is frozen, totally frozen, and wages are being slashed. Obamacare means higher prices, fewer choices, and lower quality.
Ann Holton was campaigning for Hillary Clinton and her husband, vice presidential nominee Tim Kaine. Holton says she's admired Clinton for helping families and children, and that no one is more qualified than Clinton to be president. While the Affordable Care Act is taking a lot of criticism, Holton says Clinton is pushing for better health care, starting with pharmaceutical costs.
Both she and Tim have focused on that as an issue that we need to figure out what we can do. You know, we have controls in place with respect to Medicaid drug costs, but that we don't use for Medicare. That's, I think, something that's a potentially fairly easy fix, really.
That very same day, Donald Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., spoke to students at Iowa State University, talking about how they'll be the ones stuck with the decisions made by politicians now, like Obamacare.
There's the difference between optics and actually handling insurance. For the average person, it's really penal. You know, if you have a $9,000 deductible, you're coming out of pocket for all of that. You basically don't have insurance.
Let's go inside Iowa politics now, talking about the people not trying to move to the White House. Negative campaign ads are a part of politics that really nobody likes, but that many voters have accepted as just a necessary evil. There is careful planning, though, that goes into the negative ads we're seeing in local races in 2016.
She raised taxes and fees on Iowa families and businesses.
While voters have to deal with months of grainy video and daunting music, turns out there is a strategy to when negative campaign ads hit the airwaves and why.
Blum actually wrote articles in support of privatizing Social Security on Wall Street.
Kelly Olgenbruns and Hans Hassel studied 1,400 campaign emails from 100 randomly selected House races in the 2012 cycle. Conventional wisdom says campaigns would start positive, get negative, then finish positive at the end.
And that's what you see with open seat races.
Neither candidate is well known to the public. Both candidates try to say, hey, look, you don't know me, let me introduce myself.
In 2014, that was what happened in Iowa's first congressional district race between businessman Rod Blum, who had never held elected office before, and a longtime State House Representative Pat Murphy.
Rod Blum was politically unknown, right? People don't know who he is, so he has to go out and say, look, here I am, this is who I am, this is why you should vote for me. Whereas now he has an established record. And Monica Vernon can say, look, this is the battle that we're fighting over.
Hassel says that's the main difference between an open seat race and one where the candidate is seeking re-election. It's the knowledge about the incumbent's position on any issue.
That incumbent has a set of positions. They've been involved in these partisan battles in some way. And so there's this distinct political ground on which they're fighting.
Iowans have seen a lot of that in Iowa's 1st and 3rd district races, where Monica Vernon is fighting Congressman Blum and Jim Maurer is trying to take out David Young. Competitiveness matters too. Kelly says races that have a heavy frontrunner are less likely to get negative towards the candidate likely to lose.
Whether you're slightly ahead or slightly behind, you're just as likely to go negative. You're going to go negative about 50 to 60% of the time when you're being really competitive.
Don't think you're safe when you turn the TV off. Generally, the same campaign message is sent out through all different mediums, whether it's negative or positive. That race in Iowa's 1st district has brought one organization into town to turn out Democratic voters specifically to beat Congressman Blum. The Progressive Turnout Project sent out this mailer trying to lean on voters to vote based on peer pressure, talking about their neighbors voting. They specifically, even at the very bottom, ask voters to support Monica Vernon against Rod Blum. There's an even more overt appeal in a letter that they sent out to residents with their official voting records. This letter is the one that was sent to my home. There it shows my voting record, 1 for 4, and promises to check back in after the election is over. For the record, I did actually vote in 2008, 2010, and 2012. I just voted in New Jersey, where I was living at the time. Both Republican Secretary of State Paul Pate and Democrat Lynn County Auditor Joel Miller say they don't like that kind of guilt trip strategy, but there is nothing illegal about those groups sending out those mailers. Coming up after the break, we run through some of the ballot measures you'll see all throughout eastern Iowa on November 8th and debunk some common voting myths about casting your ballot. Welcome back. Heading to your local polling place and casting your ballot is your right as an American, but it can also be pretty intimidating. So we're taking the time to lay out some of the biggest parts of the ballot that you'll have to navigate and also debunking some voter myths. In the corridor area, there are 3 main ballot measures you'll find, but only in Lynn and Johnson County. For the first one, it handles an issue that's been a focus of work at the State House for months now, water quality. Des Moines Water Works is suing 3 rural counties for nitrates that their farmers put into the water, and Governor Branstad has tried to get funding for water quality initiatives last session, but the State House didn't take any action on it. The Lynn County supervisors say in the next 20 or 30 years, Lynn County could have similar issues, so they're asking voters to approve a $40 million bond for the Lynn County Conservation Board to take various steps to improve water quality while also improving parks under their care. The other big issue on the ballot in Lynn County is about the County Board of Supervisors and if they should stay at 5 members or be shrunk down to 3. Weeks ago, we talked to Brent Olson, who represents District 4 in mostly rural Lynn County. He worries that without 5 supervisors, his constituents wouldn't be well represented.
People that vote for me that I directly represent are from Marion, are from Central City, are from Bertram.
Olson says a strong Cedar Rapids is good for Lynn County, but with just 3 seats, the board may be dominated by supervisors elected by the voters who mostly live in the city, and something like the much-needed improvements on Lakeside Road may have never happened. Olson says that's how it was before the board expanded in the late 2000s, when he says road budgets and rural priorities suffered. He says the same thing happened when the Cedar Crossing Casino project was figuring out who would pay for what.
We were asked to bond $25 million to build a parking garage and own the parking garage for the casino. And I fought that and said no.
He says the temptation to become what he calls an extension of the Cedar Rapids City Council is there all the time. It's up to the supervisors to push back.
We're working with them, but keeping them in check. It protects the county taxpayer.
One of the most vocal opponents of the supervisors has been Kevin Kula.
The one thing that I have found out since I started going to the meetings and stuff, there's not enough work there for 5 people, let alone 3 full-time.
He argues that rural Linn County isn't represented when the supervisors give hundreds of thousands of dollars to artwork that ends up throughout Cedar Rapids while the Abbey Center gets shut down. Linn County Supervisor John Harris also represents a rural part of Linn County. He says what's clear over the past 6 months is that there are some people who just don't like what the supervisors are doing and how they do it.
I'm not sure that that's coming from the silent majority or the vocal minority.
In Johnson County, Iowa City voters are considering decreasing the percentage of signatures they would need for initiative and referendum petitions. Much of the 2016 focus has been on the presidential race, but there is another big vote on the back of the ballot in Iowa. Steffi Lee explains this year's judicial retention election.
Designed like an election ballot, you may have seen these big black yard signs calling to remove Justices Apple, Katie, and Hecht.
We're asking voters to turn the ballot over and vote no on the 3 Iowa Supreme Court justices.
Social conservative group The Family Leader was one of the main forces driving out 3 justices after the unanimous 2009 decision on same-sex marriage in Iowa. This year, they're urging Iowans to think back to that ruling, as well as the court's 2015 decision to strike down the telemedicine abortion ban.
These 3 judges are a prime example of justices who do not honor and respect the constitutional limits to their own power. And that's why they need to go.
The Iowa State Bar Association says these justices have made every decision based on the law, and by voting yes to retain them, it ensures that politics won't get into Iowa's courts.
81%, 88%, 91%.
Chair of the Fair and Impartial Courts Committee, Guy Cook, points out that these Supreme Court justices all received high marks from Iowa lawyers on their judicial performance evaluations.
And they're asked to rate the judges on their temperament, their knowledge of the law, how they treat people, the fairness of their rulings.
The Iowa State Bar Association launched a website where voters can access these reviews. They've also put up Vote Yes signs, pressing Iowans to help maintain fair and impartial courts. Their main message,
judges are not politicians,
is that the makeup of Iowa's courts should never be driven by politics, but a focus on justice.
The people who know these judges best, the lawyers who appear before them, have said they're all worthy of retention.
You can find the judicial performance evaluations on our website. We've also gotten some information about people being very confused about some of the most basic parts of voting in a general election, so we're laying out exactly how this process works. First off, you just need to be registered to vote, but in Iowa, you are allowed to register to vote right before you cast your ballot, either when you vote early or when you vote on Election Day. You just need to provide ID and fill out the form to register. You can do that online or by mail, but those deadlines have already passed. For this election, you can do it in person at your voting location. As soon as you're registered, you can cast your ballot. If you like to vote early, you can do it at any county auditor's office or at any location that they designate as a place to vote early. Early voting started September 29th and it runs through the day before Election Day, and your precinct does not matter. If you're waiting to vote on Election Day, then your precinct does matter. You need to find your specific polling location. If you voted in Iowa before, you do not need to show an ID. But if you're first time voting, a current photo ID, a current utility bill, a current bank statement, or a copy of a paycheck or a government document with your name and address all work as a form of identification. One big problem that we've been hearing about voters, though, is thinking that your party that you're registered with will be a problem when you cast your ballot. Here in the general election, the party you're registered with doesn't matter at all. You can vote for whoever you want to, and your vote will still count. Coming up next on Iowa in Focus, we dive deeper into the effort from Republicans to try to save their majority in the Senate. Welcome back. In the real story this week, we take a deeper look at the effort from Republicans to save their majority in the Senate. The House of Representatives is safely Republican, but the Senate is in play in 2016, and it could have a massive impact on some of the most basic ways that Congress works or doesn't. In a 2016 election full of FBI investigations and accusations of sexual assault, earning a spot in Congress may have less to do with riding presidential coattails than ever before.
Both parties are aware of the potential for problems at the top of the ticket to affect races lower down.
That's roughly how it's played out in Ohio's Senate race for incumbent Republican Rob Portman. He's considered a moderate who could have been vulnerable in a time where the fringe outside candidate is popular. Instead, he's outraised his opponent by millions and has a double-digit lead in the polls. Iowa Senator Joni Ernst says his race is a good benchmark for the rest of the Senate.
Because he has demonstrated the hard work for his constituents, they recognize that, and they want him to return to the United States Senate.
In Wisconsin, one of the few successful Tea Party Republicans is in a much harder fight. Ron Johnson rode the anti-Obamacare wave into Congress in 2010 and was trailing at one point by double digits. He's tightened that race since then, but Wisconsin went Democrat in the last two presidential races.
It looks at this point, at least, like he won't be reelected this year.
New Hampshire is more than just the nation's first primary. Sitting Democratic Governor Maggie Hassan is challenging Republican Senator Kelly Ayotte for her Senate seat. Ayotte broke with the GOP to support President Obama's plan to cut carbon emissions, but Hassan is trying to hold her accountable for Donald Trump's statements.
I continue to be surprised by how much she has been willing to stand with Donald Trump.
Illinois is shaping up to be one of the Democrats' biggest Senate victories. Republican Mark Kirk was a vulnerable incumbent anyway before he and Democratic challenger Tammy Duckworth met on a debate stage.
You know, my family has served this nation in uniform going back to the Revolution. I'm a daughter of the American Revolution. I've bled for this nation.
I had forgotten that your parents came all the way from Thailand to serve George Washington.
Duckworth actually is descended from Revolutionary War veterans, and she has a Purple Heart of her own from fighting in Iraq. The current rules in the Senate mean you need 60 votes to end debate on most issues and begin voting to pass legislation. It's safe to say whoever wins the Senate majority on November 9th won't have the 60 seats. Of the 34 seats up for re-election shown here in gray, 9 of them are safely Democratic, 14 are safely Republican. That means the Democrats only need to take 6 to have a majority. If we end with both parties locking in 50 seats, the newly elected vice president will break all ties. The majority party in the Senate also controls all the committees, which has held up President Obama's Supreme Court nomination for nearly a year now. Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley only took over the committee that has the power to stall that confirmation process when Republicans got their Senate majority back in 2014. Another concern for some Republicans has been voter fraud. Donald Trump has stirred concerns that if he loses, it would be because the process would have been manipulated to keep him out of the White House. But around the nation, the efforts to maintain election integrity are just as controversial. 20 states across the U.S. don't make registered voters show ID every time they head to the polls, and Iowa is one of them. On the other end of the spectrum is where you find states like Wisconsin, Kansas, and a few others where ballots won't count unless a voter can provide some form of identification. It's nearly impossible to find an elected official who would favor making it easier to commit voter fraud. The problem comes with the documentation and sometimes the costs to get an official ID. Generally, those costs keep minority voters from getting the documentation they need more than white voters. Former Attorney General Eric Holder has compared laws like the ones in those states to poll taxes that were around in the Jim Crow era, specifically to keep black voters from casting ballots.
We're the only advanced democracy on earth that purposely tries to make it harder for people to vote.
Right now in North Carolina, the NAACP is filing a federal lawsuit over what they call a last-minute purging of the voter rolls. Grace Hardison is one of the voters who wants to cast her ballot, but her registration was canceled.
Do you ever think you were going to get this much attention?
I sure did.
Anybody that told me that, I'll tell you something wrong.
The NAACP says thousands of voter registrations were removed after they were challenged when mass mailings were returned. That led to one third-party group challenging the residency of the people who were supposed to be living at that address. The NAACP says in many instances the voters do live there, or they moved within the county and are still eligible to vote. Many critics say the steps to prevent voter fraud don't match the actual threat. In 14 years, one professor found 31 instances of voter fraud that would have been prevented by stricter laws. Over roughly the same time, the margin of victory in even the tightest races have been hundreds or even thousands of votes. Iowa's voter ID laws are generally pretty lenient. Like we said before, you only need to show an ID the first time you vote, as long as your information hasn't changed. But this year, Des Moines police charged a woman with election misconduct after election officials say she voted twice. The Polk County attorney says it's one of the few examples he's actually seen of voter fraud in 25 years. Coming up next, we're almost done, but so is the 2016 campaign cycle. Welcome back. Now we take a look at their voice. It's what your officials are posting on social media. Halloween was Monday, so we got some pretty great Halloween tweets. Vice President Joe Biden was with his family getting ready when we found out about this picture, and the caption, "All you need for a Biden Halloween are pumpkins and aviators." The vice president is known for wearing those sunglasses pretty much everywhere. On the other side of the aisle, former presidential candidate and current Texas Senator Ted Cruz went trick-or-treating with his young daughters as the Phantom of the Opera. You can follow along on Twitter or Facebook all week long, and be sure to follow along, especially on election night on Tuesday. We'll be pretty active on both social media platforms while we watch the returns come in that night. Every week we end with the week ahead, and we all know what is going on this week, what the campaigns are up to. Election Day is Tuesday. Thanks for watching. Be sure to tune in next week to get the clear facts right here on Iowa in Focus.